Alumni Association of Nigeria. So the Africa Policy Dialogue series is aimed at really enabling discussions around policy measures that would contribute to the enhancement of growth and development in Nigeria and Africa. And the theme for today's webinar is key issues that will affect how Nigerians decide, elections 2023 and beyond. Our democracy faces another crucial test as presidential, parliamentary, state gubernatorial, and assembly elections are scheduled for the 25th and 11th of March, 2023, respectively. And this presidential election will be the 7th since the current wave of our liberal democracy formally started in 1999. And about 93.5 million people, Nigerians, will be eligible to vote for a presidential candidate of their choice. So in a few days, the largest, most youthful Nigerian electorate will head to the polls. The 2022 Electoral Act introduced innovations like the electronic transmission of results directly from the polling units, and then the BVAS system that we've all heard about. And this is intended to curb election rigging and may have contributed to some kind of renewed hope around the election process, because INEC reported an additional 12 million newly registered voters across the 36 states. However, in this defining moment in our history, civic fatigue remains an important challenge as insecurity, the economy, and corruption continue to be key issues for citizens. So when the team and I were curating this webinar and thinking about what may be a more impactful conversation to have as a policy school, what kept coming up was the fact that we didn't want to focus on personalities or parties, but rather to curate content that focuses on the needs and expectations of citizens and to nudge Nigerians towards making informed voting choices. So our objectives were twofold. First, we wanted to highlight the key trends shaping voter participation in the upcoming elections and what factors were influencing these trends. And secondly, to highlight how these trends and issues of importance to voters could shape the agenda for the next administration. So we've taken some time, and it is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed moderator, Abosede George Organ, who is also the current executive secretary of our alumni association here at Harvard Kennedy School Alumni Association of Nigeria, and founder of Wylan Global. Wylan is the Women in Leadership Advancement Network. So brief introduction, Abosede is a tri-sector leader with over 20 years of experience working across non-profit, private, and public sectors as a development professional. She began her career with ActionAid International, Nigeria, and coordinated corporate social responsibility and sustainability for Keystone, First Bank, and Samsung Electronics, West Africa. As Director Strategy, Funding, and Stakeholder Management at the Lagos State Employment Trust Fund, Abosede was part of a team creating jobs in Africa's largest city by population, which is Lagos. Abosede is also host to the Leading Woman Show, election series, which airs on News Central every Sunday at 7 p.m. We're excited to have her here. I'm also super excited to have two very distinguished and brilliant gentlemen. We have with us today Samson Itodo of Yaga Africa and Dr. Chike Nwangu of NOI Polls, both doing very impactful work in Nigeria and across Africa. But I will now hand over to Bose, our moderator, to begin the conversation and to properly introduce our esteemed panelists. So thank you once again for taking time out. Sorry we started a little bit late. We're happy that you're here with us as we all walk together towards a peaceful, informed, and accountable electoral process. Over to you, Bose.
Thank you so much, Adora, for the kind introduction. I'm grateful for your leadership. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. I am so delighted to be moderating this session as we discuss the key issues that will shape how Nigerians decide 2023 elections and beyond. I will be introducing our guest speakers shortly, but first, some important information for your lovely selves who have joined us today. So you're welcome to engage with the conversation in the chat. The chat is very wide open. So later on in the agenda, we have left a significant amount of time, 15 good minutes, for you to ask questions, but don't wait till the end. Please use the Q&A box or the Q&A icon that is at the bottom of your screen to drop your questions as they come to you. You can also tweet or post any important highlights on social media and tag us at HKSalumni_NG on Instagram and Twitter. Great, so let's dive into this conversation. I think Adora has given a really good background. As many of you are aware, on the 25th of February and March 11th, about 93.5 million Nigerians will be eligible to vote for a new president, for governors, and for members of the national and state assemblies. So what we want to do in this conversation is really assess some of the key factors that could shape how voters decide in the upcoming elections and examine how these issues will shape the agenda of the next administration. And to discuss this topic with us, we have two distinguished speakers. First, let me introduce Dr. Chike Nwangu, who's the Chief Executive Officer of NOI Polls Limited. With over 13 years experience in data management, consulting, research, monitoring, and evaluation, he oversees the general management of NOI Polls' day-to-day operations. Prior to joining NOI Polls, Chike was with Health Strategy and Delivery Foundation, where he managed the data and analytics team, providing analytic support to the organization. He oversaw the performance management program of HSDF in 4 states, establishing relationships with the senior stakeholders in the states towards improving the use of data for decision-making. He also led the team providing contract management and data verification services in the performance-based financing project in Nigeria, known as the Nigeria State Health Investment Project. He is a live saved tool list expert, building the capacity to use the list to calculate health outcomes and improved saved by various improved lives by various health interventions. His previous work experience spans several organizations, including FHI 360, MSH, Global Fund, and the World Bank. Chike is a medical doctor and got his MBBS from the University of Nigeria. He also has a Doctor of Public Health degree and a Master of Public Health degree, both from the prestigious Johns Hopkins University in the US. He's a certified performance-based financing expert, and he's passionate about data and evidence gathering across all sectors. Chike is currently focused in expanding NOI Polls operations across the West African sub-region. Welcome, Chike. It's a delight to have you here today.
Thanks, Abosede. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the great introduction.
Great. And now I'm going to introduce our second speaker, Samson Itodo. Samson Itodo is the Executive Director of YAGA Africa. Samson is a community organizer and development practitioner with over 13 years experience in elections, parliamentary strengthening, constitution building, and youth development. He led the movement for the reduction of age limits for running for public office in Nigeria, popularly known as the Not Too Young to Run movement. He served on the National Assembly's Institutional Reforms Committee to design a strategic framework to strengthen Nigeria's National Assembly, and he has facilitated legislation and policies on constitutional and electoral governance. Under his leadership, YAGA Africa has emerged as a leading civic organization promoting political inclusion, electoral integrity, and public accountability in Africa. Samson co-chairs the focal group on the Nigerian Youth Investment Fund, which is a fund established by the government of Nigeria to fund youth enterprise and innovation. He's a fellow of the prestigious Archbishop Desmond Tutu Leadership Program and the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. Samson holds a bachelor's and master's degree in law and a Master of Public Policy from the University of Oxford Blavatnik School of Government. He currently serves on the board of International IDEA and the Kofi Annan Foundation. Samson is invested in building the next generation of leaders with the requisite capacity, character, and competence to transform Africa. Welcome, Samson. Good to have you here today.
Thank you very much, Abose.
Great. Fantastic. So let's dive into this conversation. We want to start, and let me just give both of you 5 minutes each to give some opening remarks on our topic. What are the key issues that you think will shape how voters decide in the upcoming elections, and why are these particular issues of importance to voters? Chike, let me start with you.
Thanks, Abosede. And let me start with apologizing to everyone. My voice is really bad, so I'm just going to speak slowly for the rest of this webinar. I think this is a very timely topic, and I'd like to say that I'm pretty much excited about the forthcoming elections. One, it's a very different election from everything that we've been used to. And it's actually critical that we have this kind of conversations, because I think this 2023 elections are going to throw up things that we're not used to. So it's important that we kind of understand the narrative and try to drive the issues that should be on the top burner of everyone that's considering to be part of the system that's going to produce the next batch of leaders that will lead this country forward. Again, I think there's so much issues on the table that are driving why there is so much focus on this particular round of elections. At NOI Polls, we've done several work on trying to interrogate the issues rather than focusing on the individuals that are coming out for the posts, but rather to just understand what people consider as important to them and what whoever is going to lead should focus on going forward. So I think this is timely. Can I share the slide now, or should I just wait a little bit?
Yes, please go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay. All right. So I was saying that at NOI Polls, we've done a series of elections polls that we were focusing a lot more on the issues that enable the system, right, as to get people to vote and people to make an informed decision on who they want to vote, as well as interrogating the system that creates the avenue to vote. And among other issues, there's certain things that I wanted to highlight that kind of speaks to the topic why we're here today. So we've asked questions around what do people, just a minute, let me pull up the slide. So as everyone, we've done several series, so I will repeat several questions just to make sure if we can identify some trends. And what we try to ask again, these are highlights of the poll. This is not the entire poll. This is showing some of the results that speak to conversations we're having now. And we're asking, what is the most important issue to you that you expect a candidate to address? And I'm going to show a couple of slides to show that the trend, that these are the issues that are affecting Nigerians, and it didn't really change across time. So we asked, and this was sometime in November, what is the most important issue to you that you expect the candidate to address? And top of the list was insecurity, economy, and unemployment. And the point that I wanted us to look at is across gender, across age, is pretty much the same thing people are looking at. Well, so when you come to insecurity, and insecurity, of course, has some particular focus in the country, but these are the three issues that are driving the point: insecurity, economy, and unemployment. And if you look at it totally, you can see they're all tied together.
So I think we'll...
Yeah.
Chike, are you there?
Yeah, I'm back. I think I got cut off.
Okay. And if for the purpose of sharing your slides, you want to turn off your video, that's fine as well.
All right, thanks. We'll do that. Okay, so I was saying, were the top 3 issues, and we also repeated this the second time. Again, it was insecurity, economy, and unemployment. This was in December. And the third time we did this in January, again, was insecurity, inflation, and unemployment. So in essence, we're saying that the 3 issues that are top of everyone's concern still has to do with insecurity, economy, and unemployment in Nigeria. And I don't think any candidate that is not trying to address these issues is going to make a push towards getting people to vote for him. The second thing that we felt we should interrogate was ask people what they think that can be done to encourage more people to come out and vote during the elections. As we all know that we have very serious voter apathy in Nigeria, and we try to understand what do you think will make people come out to vote. Top of the list was sensitization on the masses on the importance of elections, and assurance of security and assurance of free and fair elections. These were the top 3 reasons. Again, this is really cut across different political zones, but the point I'm making is that sensitizing the masses and assuring people of security and assuring that this is going to be a free and fair election is what is going to drive people to come out. I'd like to say something, one of the polls that we asked anyway, we did ask people if they believe their votes count in Nigerian election. And surprisingly, almost 66% of people, 2/3 of 66% of people that we spoke to said they believe that their votes will count. So there's a lot of things that are pointing towards the fact that we anticipate that there will be a much more increased voter turnout in this turnoff of elections, which include the point that the critical issues that people want to affect everybody as a whole, and then maybe that will drive people to come out. The third point that I wanted to raise, sorry, my voice is going. The third point I wanted to raise before I take a break is a lot has been talked about getting the presidential candidates to talk and debate, to talk about.
Okay, so Chike, maybe that's a good time for you to take a pause. Let me go over to Samson. And Samson, you heard some of those trends, not surprising. So security, the economy, unemployment, inflation, which honestly, at the end of the day, there are 2 key issues, security and the economy. And then I think Chike's last point about what will encourage voters to actually come out and vote. So assurance of security and that their votes will count. So Samson, over to you for your opening remarks, and if you can touch on some of those points.
Well, thank you very much. Is it coming back? Okay.
I'm back, but I think Samson can go ahead.
Yeah, Chike, if you just stop sharing, and then I think you can speak to it. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Go ahead, Samson.
Well, thank you very much, Abosode, and thanks, Adora and team, for the invitation to contribute to this discussion. I'm not surprised that this is coming a few days to the elections, and my hope that all those who participate in this particular webinar will have a better understanding of why these elections are critical, but not just a better understanding. For those who are joining the call who are undecided, we hope that you move from being an undecided registered voter to one who will be deciding or has decided, because I think that this webinar is quite powerful and very strategic. I'm glad that it's coming a week to the general elections. I'm not surprised with the data Chike shared, because when you talk about insecurity, you talk about the economy, all these are instrumental outcomes of democracy. They are, the outcomes that determines whether a particular democratic government or a particular institution is legitimate. And this is, what we call output legitimacy. So I'm not surprised that people, responded in the manner that they did, because in actual fact, why does government exist? government exists to serve the interest of the people. And that social contract that exists within the people, between government and the people, is one that won't be renegotiated next week. Because when you talk about social contract, you know, there are two agreements that are involved in social contract. And the first one is, you know, that we as a people decide to confer on the state some responsibility to protect and provide for our welfare. And in turn, we give them some rights on decision-making power. And what they will do is, you know, to protect and address issues related to our welfare. But then I think three things are on the ballot, in addition to the points that Chike made. The first one is identity is on the ballot next week. And when I say identity, ethnic identity and religious identity is on the ballot next week. Because you look at the whole candidate selection process and how some of the parties have tried to renegotiate the social compact, they've tried to renegotiate, you know, that glue that holds us together as a country. A lot of people are going to be voting next week because they want to make a point. And it's either making a point that political parties and candidates don't have the power to renegotiate certain contracts without excluding the people. And this is tied to the geographical extraction of some of the candidates and whether power is going to be retained in the northern part of the country, or it needs to go to the southern part of the country, or it's about the Muslim ticket. We can't shy away from this issue, and this issue is on the ballot next week. And so if you look at a post-election period, my hope and belief is that the next president will undertake a national reconciliation program after the 2023 election to address this issue around polarization, because this current sort of political leadership has not only fragmented the country, but think about it as Nigerians who are the country. Do you have a sense? Do you feel that this country is united the way, you know, the affairs of the state are being run? So that's one. The second thing that, you know, is on the ballot next week, it's justice. Nigerians are clamoring for justice because they've been subjected to long years of oppression. And it's this sense of justice that, you know, triggered the NSAS protest. It's this sense of justice, you know, that has forced Nigerians to ask questions about the nature of our security architecture, whether this concentration of power at the center and then component units have to come begging the federal government for support or for bailout is sustainable. And so when people go to vote, they are actually going to be voting for justice. They want a leader or leaders that can, you know, address the injustice and the structural inequities in our system. This point about restructuring, this point about, you know, devolution of power is going to be a big issue. And if Nigeria is going to harness its potential, quite frankly, decentralization of power in Abuja or in the federal government needs to be revisited. The third and perhaps the last point, and this is just adding to, you know, the issue, the issues that Chike raised with respect to what issues are going to shape how citizens vote next week. It's hope. All through the voter registration process and the build up to the election, there's one thing that I have seen on the minds and the hearts of Nigerians is this firm belief that the democratic system still remains the best form of government despite its shortcomings. And if this wasn't the case, then the 9.4 million new registered voters who registered to vote wouldn't have registered. Then the clamor and the demand and the pressure for collection of PVCs wouldn't have been the case. And I think that, you know, the fact that we sit and we prepare for this election as though it's going to be a festival again, despite the insecurity, despite, the Naira crisis, as well as the fuel crisis, really gives me hope. And so hope is on the ballot. Hope that Nigerians can vote and reclaim the state.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Samson. So 3 additional points to the points that Chike had made earlier: identity, justice, and hope. Chike, let me come back to you. Samson was just talking about the newly registered voters. So according to INEC, young people aged 18 to 34 account for 37 million of the total registered voters, which is almost 40%. And those aged 35 to 49 represent an additional 35%. And so, Chike, my question is, could these shifting demographics be responsible for the prominent issues that are of priority to voters? What do you think?
Absolutely, Abosede, absolutely. And thanks, Samson, for putting everything in 3 points. I'm going to focus back on the last point on hope, right? Through this whole election series, what we've seen and the work that we've done is there seems to be an urgency and eagerness of Nigerians to take back the country. I can confidently beat my chest and say that the outcome of the election is going to be the people's choice, barring any other, thing that can happen. Because again, you look through the whole, I don't think we've had this kind of participation in the elections, in the election process, in any election in the past before, starting from registration, collection of PVCs, even the rallies that are going around. In my point, I don't think the rallies are really about the candidates per se. It really, I believe, is really about the process of the election. You see people coming out en masse to attend the rallies. You see people coming out en masse to make the movement about making the picking up the PVCs. And there's a point that Samson raised that I also agree with. I think you can tie a lot of these movements to the NSAS movement, as in that feeling of that it is time for us to really drive the narrative of how and where we want this country to head. And you can see the NSAS maybe taught people that if you do want to implement change, you have to go through the ballot box. Is one of the quickest ways to implement change. And that is kind of translating to what we're seeing now. I see a lot of similarities in the NSAS movement and in the movement that has been pushing people to come out and vote who they want to vote. And like you rightfully said, if you look at the age demographics of people that are registering newly, picking up their PVCs, it's the same group of people that do want to drive how the country is going to go forward. Thank you, Ambassador. Sorry,
no worries. We understand. So, Samson, this is your primary constituency based on the work that you do. So would you say that this is going to, some people are calling it a young people's election. Do you agree?
Well, we expect that it will be, but the only way that can happen is if young people show up to vote. The demography and the population is in their favor, but quite frankly, I think that, again, part of what this webinar seeks to do is citizens mobilization. And if those numbers don't show up at the polling units at 8 a.m. on the 25th and March 11th, then it remains nothing but just statistics for academics and election practitioners to analyze, and perhaps also media. Because in the 2019 elections, for the presidential election, the youth turnout was just 28%. In the governorship election, it was 29%. Because prior to 2023, there were about 51% of registered voters were young people. And of the 29 million or so who voted during the 2019 elections, only 12 million young people, showed up to vote. And our expectation is that that figure is going to rise in view of some of these factors, both NSAS and as well as the discontent and anger in the land. I'm sure it's going to push people to vote. So we hope that these young people show up. That there's strategic mobilization, to get them out. I'm quite optimistic that a lot of young people will show up to vote. But it's one thing to show up, it's another thing for the votes to count, because it's going to take vigilance on the part of these young people and citizens who show up to protect, their vote. We wait to see if INEC publishes the data collected PVCs, then we can start making projections about turnout.
So Samson, can I stay with you and talk a little bit about, so a lot of people say, will my vote count? But we all agree that this new Electoral Act has promise. So can you talk a little bit about why people should go out and vote and some of the things that this new Electoral Act makes provision for, and I guess to a certain degree, the preparedness of INEC that should at least give people confidence that regardless of what happens, show up and vote. And then maybe talk a little bit about security at the polling units, because I think that's of great importance, like Chike mentioned earlier.
I think that if you study the sociology of the Nigerian voter, and you also study how our institutions work, you can have the best of legislation. The challenge is the society has its own problems and issues that we need to talk about. And so permit me to focus more on society and not focus on the role of the state, and in this case, the law and its framework. Because yes, there are several provisions in the Electoral Act that guarantee the sanctity of the vote. But to implement and enforce that requires vigilance on the part of citizens. And if you're here and you're a registered voter, and we've said this consistently, how do you ensure your votes count? First, you need to show up early at the polling unit on election day. You need to understand the process. And what's the process? That the BVAS, which is the device for accreditation, will be used for electronic accreditation. So do not allow a presiding officer to issue you a ballot paper to vote without accrediting you with the BVAS, because it could amount to overvoting, and the consequence thereof will be cancellation of votes at the polling unit. So every Nigerian who shows up at election next week and in March should insist that they are accredited with the BVAS. Before voting starts, they need to also check the BVAS that the figures for accreditation is 0 in the field for accreditation. The presiding officer is required to show the public, that the BVAS has 0 records. After accreditation and voting has been concluded, it is important to also watch to see that the presiding officer records the actual number of people accredited using the BVAS on the result sheets, because the BVAS is a device, but it doesn't electronically collate results. Someone has to copy the figure from the BVAS to the result sheet. So your vigilance is required. And this is why we say, if it's safe in your polling unit, please, when you vote, do not leave the polling unit. Remain there and keep watch over the process. This is the amount and the level of vigilance that Nigerians need, to protect their vote. But if you look at what happened with Osun, overvoting can be used to manipulate election. And so citizens need to be alive to, what are the tricks and the rules in the playbook of politicians to undermine the integrity of our elections. And to pivot into the discussion about security and the role that security officials play, it's clear they have a duty and a mandate to provide security for voters, for INEC officials, and the election materials. But INEC has undergone or has experienced attacks on its offices, and these attacks threaten its preparations for the elections. But it's just disturbing that despite assurances from security agencies that they're deploying massively for the elections, we still see these security breaches, which raises the question of, first, the commitment on the part of the state to ensure that this election holds and it creates a peaceful environment. And I say this even as students of public policy. the state has a responsibility to ensure that a safe and secure environment is provided for citizens to exercise, their franchise. And the state cannot abdicate that responsibility. We have to hold the state and keep the fire, on those institutions who have a duty, to secure us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Samson. Now, Chike, let's assume Nigerians go out to vote. Elections are peaceful, they are deemed free and fair, a new administration is elected. What should the top priorities of the next administration be?
Thanks, Abosede. I mean, from our findings, it's clear what the people want the next administration to address. It's insecurity, it's state of the economy, and it's poverty levels, unemployment, if you want to look at it. The second and the third are kind of tied together, so I'm still going to say it's insecurity and state of the economy. I mean, these are the things that are on people's top burner, quite all right, but as a person following the election process, there's so much more that needs to be done. There's so much more that needs to be done. Samson pointed out to you in terms of our unity as a nation needs to be not ignored anymore, as in these are things that people at the next administration needs to address to make sure that this doesn't fester and become something else. On top of the burner, people are angry, people are hungry. The next administration has to address insecurity, has to address the economy. These are the things that, no doubt, they have to do something about, or else it's just going to create an agitated group of people that you can really handle. So those are the top two things that I would say that they need to, the next administration needs to focus on.
Perfect. Before I come to Samson, I just want to invite our audience to engage in the chat. And then, of course, if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A box and we'll definitely get to it. So, Samson, from your perspective, what would you say the top priorities of the next administration should be?
Well, I think Chike has said it all. And I just think, as when you asked that question, I said, who are, let's assume, and I try to just look at the top three candidates and say, okay, well, what would be their priority? I think three things come to mind. In addition to, and I completely agree with Chike, I think the first thing that the next administration needs to prioritize is how do you bridge this trust gap between society and the state? No government succeeds anywhere without the trust of its citizens. And the need to cultivate, and earn that trust, because the relationship between the state and society are far apart. And government, even when it acts in the interest of its citizens, because of this long years of distrust, citizens try, at all points to question government's interventions. So I think it's to fix that. And there are some actions that can be taken. First, about the kind of leadership that they select, the cabinets that they, constitute. And this is at all levels and not just the presidential levels. And you've got to balance, technical expertise as well as diversity management or politics. And that is important for, in terms of the priority that needs to be set. The second sort of priority, and to just unpack the economic contribution that Chike made, I think the next government needs to prioritize this debate about taxation. Nigeria needs to rethink its tax policy. And it's about whether you're going to expand the tax net or you're going to increase the amount of taxes that people pay. Yes, this administration has tried, to look at our revenue generation, and that's something, we have to prioritize, because this monolithic approach towards solving our economic problems needs to be sort of revisited. The third one, institutions must work. Institutions must work. And the next administration needs to prioritize strengthening public institutions to deliver social good to people. This practice and this tradition of undermining public institutions by not constituting, the leadership with competent individuals, but instead sycophancy and partisanship is the driving philosophy for selecting leaders. That needs to change. So in the midst of all the macro actions that the next administration needs to take, I think these are very little things and choices that the next leadership must make that can make a significant difference in our national life.
Great, thank you, Samson. So Chike, I saw that poverty was next to security, economy, unemployment. I think we should unpack poverty a little bit. And I mean, I think given what Nigerians are going through just a few weeks to the election, how do you think that would play a role? And how can the next administration address this? Because I think to Samson's point, the economy is quite broad, isn't it? And then obviously impacts on those livelihoods that ensures that we either reduce poverty or, well, we're not at the point of eradicating it yet, I guess. What do you say, Chike?
Yeah, thanks, Abosede. I mean, after I tried pointing out when people say, when we do polls, ask people what should the government focus on? They mention poverty, they mention unemployment, they mention things that are still all related to poverty. So like you said, it's a very wide spectrum of what people define as poverty. So, and I think the best way to look at it is the needs of the people being met. So it's not in the sense of poverty or people need to have more cash to be able to purchase what they want, but it's basically to know whether the needs of the general populace is being met. And there's a point Samson made that kind of leads to what we generally define. I think the trust between the state and the people in Nigeria as it is now, I just stop short of saying is broken, because in every other sector that we do, you see the people that are constantly querying the motives and every single policy that the current government puts into place. Whether it's for good or whether it's for bad, people just don't trust what comes out of it. So my point, as in response to your question, I think this is one of the major reasons why people are anxious about this particular election going forward. And I think it's going to play a role in the choices people make, unfortunately. I know we did a poll about vote buying, and I'm just going to bring that up now because some of the current issues that are going. Vote buying, of course, is an issue that pervades Nigerian elections. We can't run away from that. There's a lot of discussion around how the new currency is going to affect that as a whole. But I'd like to say that it's probably going to be on both sides. I mean, it could be a good thing that there isn't enough cash in circulation to buy votes, but at the same time, it could also be that there's so little cash in the circulation that whoever is able to provide that cash gets the vote that he wants anyway. Because in our poll, people, I think about 37% of people said that they're going to sell their votes. But ending up back to your question, we can shy away that poverty plays a role in how people would cast their votes at the end of the day. And we're in a situation where I can't really say whether the policy or the currency change policy has made that better or made that worse. Being a very optimistic person, I'm going to say that it's going to reduce that by a huge margin. But again, a lot of the conversation that we're having here, there's a very fundamental thing that I want us to agree on. No matter how much we speak about it, if a substantial number of people don't turn up on the 25th and on the 11th to cast their votes, a lot of what we're talking about here is just going to be an academic conversation. So we still need to go back to trying to see how people are going to come out and make sure that their votes count at the end of the day. But in summary, yes, poverty is going to play a role in this forthcoming election. And we do hope that this system has something in place to ensure that at least people cast that doesn't influence the choices people make as much as they can.
Great. Thank you so much, Ike. And you're doing great with your voice, by the way. So Samson, I'm going to dive in. I mean, thank you to the team for bringing my attention. I didn't see that our Q&A box was already full, and we really want this to be engaging. So thanks to everyone. Keep bringing the questions. So Samson, Onyinyechi wants to know, and I think Chike just started talking about that, but Onyinyechi wants to know specifically how this, scarcity of cash and fuel will impact on the election, and I guess, won't it compromise the citizens', ability to participate, and what do you recommend can be done to mitigate it?
Well, I align myself with the point Chike made. I think it's a dilemma, and it's neither here nor there. We just have to wait. There's a probability that it will influence. Well, it's established that one way or the other, this particular policy is going to affect citizens. It's affecting citizens as we speak. So it's going to affect citizens. It's just whether it will advance positive voting or political behavior, or it will disincentivize, participation. And my sense is, one way people are either going to get angry and they're going to show up and vote for any candidate of their choice, especially the one they trust can fix the problem. Or some people may just feel there's no point showing up, to cast their votes. It could also raise, vote buying in this election. So it's going to be a contest between the person who has access to the highest number of capital. And we say this jokingly, that the votes will be bought through promissory notes this time around. And just watch what will happen at the polling units, because they already started buying the votes. And this we call voter enticement, but definitely it will. I don't know how we're going to fix this, honestly.
Yes. And I think this particular question, Samson, is important, and I'd like you to take it. Emmanuel is saying, what are the modalities in place to support people with disabilities? So I know, again, the Electoral Act makes some provisions for people with disabilities, but Emmanuel wants to know specifically, so the blind, the deaf, albinos, other physical abilities at the polls. So that they're not disenfranchised.
The question that will be best answered by INEC, but what I know is there will be Braille ballot guides, not Braille ballots. So there will be Braille ballot guides. There will be magnifying glasses for albinos and persons who have visually impairments. There will be, they will try to locate, the voting booths in areas that are accessible to persons with disability. That's the extent that I know.
Yes, I mean, I can contribute to that to a certain degree. They are making special provisions at polling units for persons with disabilities to be prioritized. So they will actually have separate lines. And this actually applies to women who are pregnant and with little children as well. So Emmanuel, if you have anyone or you know anyone, actually it's their right to vote to be prioritized at the polling unit. So I know that to that degree. Okay, so thank you to the audience. My Q&A box is full. Great. So let me see, what haven't we touched on? What should the next, so Chike, what should the next government, both legislative and executive, do to improve general electorate confidence in our democratic institutions? Do you see progress on this in the past decade? If so, where? That's a question from Davy C.
Thanks, Ambassador. I think I'm just going to echo what Samson had said. As our institutions need to work, it cannot be based on any single individual. The progress of a country cannot be based on any single individual. It has to be based on how much of our institutions are working. And I think the next administration has to show that the institutions are doing what they're supposed to do, as at when to, with minimum interference. That is the easiest and quickest way to start building trust back. And in terms of whether we've seen any progress, we have seen some progress. We're talking about the BVAS today, and we're talking about electronic transmission of results, and these are from the last Electoral Act. I think I can give that's progress in the right direction. Trying to building on this and making this work a lot more is the first step that we need to start moving on. I'm not going to kid myself and say that it's a walk in the park. It's going to take a long process, and everyone has a role to play, both the state and both the citizens. One, for the citizens, is in continuing to ask this question that was just asked now in every forum or everywhere, and trying to hold our people accountable to this. But in summary, our institutions have to work. And I do want to say that several bills have been passed in last reform. Outside elections, we can also look at the petroleum bill and some other things that are happening. But yes, there has been some progress, but there's room for a lot more to happen. But we hope that the next administration is going to take much more step in the right direction, strengthening our institutions and making sure that they do what they're supposed to do, and they're not used as tools to push forward any agenda that the administration does have. That is also the quickest way to lose trust from the people.
Great, thank you, Chike. So one of the things that voters complain about after elections is that they do not see their representatives, until the next election cycle. So during the election, everybody comes back, everybody's available, accessible. How do you recommend that citizens hold the next administration accountable after they elect them?
They're the same ways that we hold them to account. First is to be fully aware of their campaign promises, because I think we hope that the presidential results will be declared by at least the morning of the 28th, maybe in the wee hours of 28, all things being equal. From the 29th, people should start asking, questions about how these plans are going to be implemented. Same also for governors, and so as well as legislators. We've got to hold them to higher standards, and we do that first, tracking their campaign promises. I think that something that citizens can also do is to stay, fully aware of the Constitution and its provisions, as well as the extant laws that exist. And there's a socialization problem that we need to address, because often it isn't about whether the mechanisms for accountability are not in place. They are in place, but people need to activate those mechanisms. So knowledge of the Constitution, knowledge of existing laws is critical. So when to ask the right question, directed to the right person and at the right time. Often we make demands that should be made to the executive, to the legislature or the judiciary, or vice versa. So understand how it works, that there are institutions that have certain mandates, and engage with those institutions, either through petitions, through advocacy letters, through advocacy visits, also through public protest. That is how, you engage. But one thing is key: consistency. That the engagement with the state and with elected representatives is continuous. And the one plea that I'll make to citizens is legislators in the National Assembly complain about the kinds of demands and requests that their constituents make of them. And one of the reasons is attributed to this poor understanding of the functions, of the legislature. And I think that whilst we also place, we call out legislators, citizens must also know that they are political leaders are not there to solve their domestic needs and their domestic problems. But then if you fix, leadership and you make institutions work, then there is sustainability in the delivery of public good. But if you focus more on individuals, then this trend of demands and unnecessary demands on our legislators will continue.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Chike, do you want to respond to that? How do we hold the next administration accountable?
So, like Samson said, if we actually look through our policies and our constitution, there's so much we can do to hold our leaders accountable. We just don't activate them. Yes, one can say whether if they've been activated before, whether it was seen through, but the point is we need to activate them first to see whether they work or whether they don't work. But there are provisions for you to hold your representatives accountable. You'll be surprised. We've worked on some polls trying to ask whether people even know who their representative is, both at the state level, the federal level, and at the Senate. And you'll be shocked at the number of people that don't know who their representative is, not to talk of what role the representative should be doing before you start asking whether they can hold them accountable. In one of the surveys that we did for Afrobarometer, when we asked whether people are aware that they can hold their representatives accountable, it was a very shocking low percentage that were confident that they can hold their leaders accountable. There was a lot of expectations that the people expect the executive government to be the one to hold the legislators accountable for their action, which is which turns the whole thing upside down. You actually have people responding that they expect the president to call the legislators to order when they step out of bounds. The responsibility is with the citizens to hold their representatives accountable. And there are means to do that is just for us to activate them, and then we can come back and complain that they don't work when we activate them. But the point is that they exist and we should do that. Again, is also understanding what our expectations of these representatives should be. And that's the first step. A lot of education needs to go out a lot to make our democracy stronger. People need to be aware of what they should be requesting for and how they should be holding people accountable. And then we can see if the system is really working. We need to exhaust it before we can even start punching holes into the system.
Great. So I hear a lot of more public awareness, which you think, is out there, but I guess there's not enough. Samson, I see two questions here around the tension between the judiciary, the executive, and then I'm going to throw in the legislature in terms of, promoting good governance. Like, how do we ensure that in the next administration, there is more collaboration and that we actually see the dividends of those three different arms working together?
So within a constitutional or presidential system that we practice, right, you've got these different arms of government, and those checks and balances exist between them. And they all have different roles and responsibilities. And on one part, separation of power isn't separation of government. If you have a political party that has majority, in the National Assembly and also holds the presidential seat, it doesn't mean that it is separation of government. It's one government. However, legislators need to understand their role and their responsibility in the Constitution, that they serve as a check, as oversight on the executive, regardless of political affiliation. And what should guide public policy is public interest and not partisan political interest, even though in reality, there's always a tension between, these two. And so I think that in the post-2023 era, we need legislators who can rise, to defend public interest. This is why National Assembly elections are as important as the presidential elections. If we vote in people who cannot question the executive, who remain rubber stamp of the president and the governors at the state, then we are toast. So we need people who are courageous because these systems are in place. But it's in this administration we are told, a senior legislator in Nigeria told us that his constituents didn't vote him into office to go and challenge the executive. For heaven's sake, how do you say that, in a democracy? And this is the mentality. Yes, cooperation, and coordination is important. But then there are certain principles that also regulate that relationship. And so accountability is at the heart of it. The second point around this sort of relationship, and I love what the APC administration did in trying to build harmony and consensus, where they set up executive as well as legislative committees to help harmonize their position. But is the outcome of that, public interest? Does it serve public interest, or it serve the interest, of politicians? And this is where citizens have a role to play. And I think that demand side, and we must commend the Nigerian people. The 2022 Electoral Act came as a result of public pressure. There were times when the National Assembly, inserted some provisions, but Nigerians spoke. And the legislators had no option but to reverse their position on certain issues, because that's what democracy is about. It's about making quality noise. Noise is important, but quality noise, that puts alternatives on the table. And so when you do that, you give, the political leaders options to choose. And we've seen how this has actually worked. And for me, the last thing about this relationship is the rule of law, the respect for the rule of law. I know those of you who are part of this alumni association are Harvard, and you represent the creme de la creme of society. But I must make my position actually known on this. This thing that happened this morning, where the president, through a presidential broadcast, ignored the Supreme Court, it's dangerous for our democracy. And quite frankly, it's unfortunate that the president, could sound and speak in the way that he did regardless. And even though in his speech, he noted, the action taken by the Supreme Court, but I think undermining the Supreme Court through a national broadcast is quite unfortunate. And I hope that, the president is made to understand that, this particular action shouldn't have been. But then, when you have a judiciary that does not represent justice, that, has, issued judgments in the past that yielded themselves to political compromise, what then do you expect? Because, you have to earn the respect. And where there are questionable judgments that come from our court, where judges themselves, turn the law against its head, forgetting the fact that justice is rooted in public confidence, then this is what you get. But again, we cannot, because a bad precedent has been set, continue to reinforce it. And we've got to call it out. And this is where the rule of law is important, for the political as well as social cohesion of Nigeria. And I just hope that our political leaders understand the implication of the actions, because the more you damage our institutions, the more society suffers. And it's just really, really unfortunate.
Great. Thank you so much, Samson. You've raised really, really important points about the importance of the rule of law and the fact that though these arms of government are to cooperate, they do exist distinctly to serve the interest of the public and to serve public good. Chike, we're beginning to bring this conversation to a close, but I want us to talk a little bit more about insecurity. I think the way we sort of unpacked the economy, this is something that worries every Nigerian. And if you think about the Constitution, I mean, the primary role of government is to protect the lives and properties of the nation. So what can the next administration do about insecurity?
Thanks, Abosede. I mean, first, I'd like to make a very firm statement. Security is a function of the state. It is a state's responsibility to ensure that its citizens are safe to carry about their regular activities. It ends there. There's no but, there's no if, there's no we are collected. The responsibility is of the state. And so long as the state fails to do this, people are going to take actions into their hands, and we're creating room for anarchy. So, with regards to security, the Nigerian state has failed, in my opinion, to provide assurance of security across all the geopolitical zones in the country. And if you look at the 6 geopolitical zones, you find out that the insecurity we're talking about differs across the zone. So no zone is free. Everyone has something that they're battling with. And these are things that could affect the conduct of the elections. Someone did mention that INEC has been battling a lot of challenges, and this still boils down to insecurity. So it's very clear, as in top of the ladder of what the next administration have to do is to tackle insecurity. And we're not saying that insecurity is going to end overnight, but the people need to see what the government is doing to try to address that, to raise some confidence in our institutions to be able to provide and protect for us. I know the top 3 or 4 candidates in this election have spoken about how they're going to try and address insecurity when they come in government. Again, a lot of these things are easier said from the outside, but the point that needs to be made is that there can't be any shuffling of foots or anything. It needs to be aggressive. It needs to be very clear, and you need to assure people that you're taking this as one of the priorities of things that you have to deliver as part of the government. I cannot suggest what needs to be done to improve the security, but my point is that the buck rests on the state to do something about that. And so long as the trend continues as it is now, we're heading down a very bad road in terms of where the country is in terms of insecurity. One of the Afrobarometer polls that we did kind of shows how much people are afraid of issues regarding security within their own living space. So these are things that the next coming administration has to focus on and do and tackle immediately.
Great, thank you very much, TK. So we have a few more minutes to go. If you have any final questions, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box. But Samson, there's a question here about, and I think you mentioned earlier, about the importance of unifying Nigeria, potentially restructuring. And so there's a question here about given the flaws in the 1999 Constitution, what pragmatic suggestions would you recommend to address these flaws? Will this be milestone around our necks? Will this be a milestone around our necks for as long as Nigeria exists?
Fellow Nigerians, we need to change our constitution. That's just it. Change the constitution. Because yes, there's an existing constitutional order, but this order has, reinforced and institutionalized injustice. There's structural inequities, and I talked about this earlier. The whole power sharing configuration needs to be revisited. You can't say you're a federal state and then you concentrate a lot of powers at the center, right? You've got to devolve powers. But you know the irony, Abosede and Chike and colleagues. The people who are saddled with the responsibility of changing the constitution are the same people who have vested interest, and they never want to make laws that advance public interest. A classic example was local government autonomy in the current constitutional amendment process. What happened? We saw the controversy between the National Assembly and the state assemblies, to the extent that the governors and the state house, they held their state houses of assembly to ransom. And the states had to negotiate. And the governor said, give us, and by I mean give us, do not pass local government autonomy, and we would let the constitutional amendment process fly. The National Assembly and the Deputy Senate President, including I think the Senate President, are on record where they were pleading with governors, to allow that the constitutional amendment process is concluded. That's our story. And this story needs to change, and it begins with changing the Constitution. Distribute powers, shift, roles and responsibilities. This debate as to the justiciability of socioeconomic rights being in Chapter 2 should be moved to Chapter 4. Reduce the power of the president, because we have one of the most powerful presidents on earth. Mm-hmm. Even the country that we adopted its own presidential system have limits on executive powers. In our own case, we have created emperors, we have protected emperors, and we continue, to reinforce, bad behavior through our constitution. And these are things that, we need to change. So I completely agree, Nigeria needs a new constitution, but the making of the new constitution is one that should involve, every Nigerian, because democracy is very expensive, right? So people need to be consulted, but so far so good. I don't think that this entire process enjoys popular support of Nigerians.
Thank you very much, Samson. This is a good time to begin to wrap up this conversation. I don't see any final questions. I think we successfully took all of them, or did one just drop? Yes, okay. Somebody's just asking about, I've seen a question about recording, about a one-pager. I'm sure that we'll provide all of that for you. So Chike, any final thoughts from your end? We've just spent, I think, almost 90 minutes talking about the key issues that will shape how Nigerians decide in 2023, the elections, but also beyond that to the next administration. What would be your final thoughts?
Thanks, Ambassador. I'm just going to focus on two things. One, we have to participate in the process. We have to turn out, we have to make our choices, and we have to follow the process through. We have to hold our leaders accountable. We can't just be speaking English about it. We have to believe that our vote counts and our voice and choices matter. That's one. Then the second point that I'm trying to make is this 2023 election presents an opportunity for us to put this country in the path that we want to. And it goes a bit beyond, for those of us that are here, it goes a bit beyond speaking about it. Like Samson mentioned, we need to educate people about what they need to do on the 25th and on the 11th. It's not enough to shout BVAS. It's not enough to shout electronic transmission of result. What does this really mean in terms of practice, as in like on that day, what am I supposed to do? So these are the two things that I encourage us here in whatever forum that we find ourselves in, whatever situation, capability we can. These are things that we need to push forward. We need to participate, and we need to be able to inform people at the local places what they need to do on these 2 days so that we can be able to put this country in the direction that we want it to go. And hopefully we're going to get a better country and a better democracy. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chike. Samson, what would be your final thoughts?
Well, Chike, you will make for a very good spokesperson for one of the campaign organizations. I wish they recruit people like you, not some of the folks that we have who are engaged in all sorts of making incendiary statements in the politics and create confusion. I think Chike says it all. Just two things, and to add to what Chike said, let's not settle for less, because it's this settling for less that has brought us to this particular point. And I hope that as we participate in this election, we raise the bar with the quality of leadership that Nigeria requires to make significant progress. because when we talked about progress earlier, incremental progress here, gradual progress, but then I think we've got to raise the bar when we evaluate what progress that we have made. The last thing is to really thank the Alumni Association for hosting this conversation. A very important conversation at a critical and defining moment for Nigeria. And like someone asked, if the three of us will be voting, I don't know if Abosede will be voting, because I know Abosede and I will be doing the job of ensuring anyone who votes, their votes are secured and not stolen by politicians. So that's our own contribution to the election. But I hope Chike is voting. But I really want to call on everyone who is here, if you have your PVC, please just go out and vote, and hope that even if your candidate does not win, that participation does not stop at that point, that it actually begins, after the election is concluded. And thank you. It's been a delight, and really appreciate the invitation and a privilege to speak to you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chike and Samson. It has been such a wonderful conversation. I want to just take 1 minute and attempt to highlight some of the things that came out of this conversation today. So the key issues informing how voters will decide, I think there were 3 top issues around security, the economy, and unemployment. But layered on that is that actually these are all because people really want to see justice and they want hope. So that's exactly what people are going to be voting for at the elections and at the polls next week and in another 3 weeks, I believe. In terms of what the next administration should prioritize, not surprisingly, it is not that different from what people are going to be voting for, which is a good thing, and which shows that, Nigerians want what they want. And again, it's Nigerians want insecurity to be addressed. They want the economy to be better. And then the importance, of course, of strengthening the public institutions that will help deliver public good. And then I think the final point around how important it is for citizens to educate themselves about the provisions of the law that allows them hold the next administration accountable. In summary, these are some of the key highlights from the conversation that we've just had. But I'm sure that Innocent will share some more about how you can get the recording of this conversation or the one pager that some people were asking about. Before I go, let me thank our guest once again for joining us to discuss this important conversation. As I pass on to Innocent Isiche, who is our Vice President of the Harvard Kennedy School Alumni Association of Nigeria, let me wish Nigeria credible and peaceful elections. It has been a delight moderating the session. Over to you, Innocent.
Thank you, Abosede. On behalf of the Harvard Kennedy School Alumni Association, I would like to sincerely express our deep thanks to each and every one of you for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure having you. I also want to say a big thank you to our moderator, Abosede, for the brilliant way in which you've handled the session. And most especially to our panelists, Chike and Samson, for the valuable insight which you've shared. I must admit I've learned a lot from it and on ways in which we can actually further deepen the civic participation in the electoral process in Nigeria. Touching on issues on voter sensitization, need to assure people of greater security during the elections, and the impact of the youths and how they're likely to shape the outcome of the elections, the forthcoming elections. You also spoke on the essential aspects of setting the agenda for the new administration on issues on economy, unemployment, inflation, security, We believe all these are relevant towards deepening the participation of Nigerian citizens in the electoral process. And they can also serve as a guide to the leaders who will emerge in the forthcoming presidential, state and national assembly elections on the pertinent issues of concern to voters, which I believe, if they are resolved, can help in supporting greater growth and development of our country. Once again, I thank you again for being with us today. Please don't forget to follow our social media handles on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Instagram to get up-to-date information and news on our upcoming events and programs.